Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Poe's detective stories, logic, philosophy, and specifically the third and final, the shortest and sweet, and Poe's favorite of his three stories. Now, I've already given a couple of talks on Poe, philosophy, logic, and his first two detective stories. Gave two longer talks on the first one, which is the most comprehensive of where he lays out his theories about emotion and logic, and I'm going to delve deeper into those as we go along into Carol, Wittgenstein, and others. But I want to give a short, sweet talk on the last of the third and shortest and sweetest of the three murder mysteries, possibly the first modern murder mysteries that were authored by Poe, along with much of the short story, the plot twist, and a lot of that in modern media is what he helped to create. And he wanted to create intellectual works that the average person can enjoy and learn from, and I believe he did, and got a good one together with the what I believe is the hidden lover of the Purloined letter. So different critics have praised each of the three stories as the best, but Poe himself said that the Purloined letter, was his best, and it is both brilliant and half the length of the other two tales. Half the shorter one, anyway, which may make it more profound according to Dupin. I'm going to pronounce the name Dupin, not Dupin, Dupin. I'm going to pronounce it like an American, Dupin, because he's duping people, whether or not he's a Dupin or a Dupin of people. He is duping people. So, like the Rue Morgue, Poe, who never went to Paris, returned to a fantastic imaginary case after worrying about his reputation and misjudging the case of Mary Rogers a bit. With Marie Roget, please see that video. Dupin and the narrator are smoking pipes by the fire discussing the two previous cases, which the narrator calls, quote, meditation and meerschaum, end quote. I had to look up meerschaum myself. It is a kind of stone known as sea foam in the German, and it is the white, ivory-like stone fitted with wooden stems that old pipes are made out of. So meditation and meerschaum, as the narrator says, when the police chief who pleaded with Dupin to take the case of Marie Roget as the, apparently, supposedly, without us told otherwise, is the chief wordless who doesn't get a line of dialogue, but Poe says he bested him and beat his pride in the end, as Dupin. Then in the second case, the chief pleads with Dupin to take the Marie Roget case, and now he comes back a third time, and he says, oh, we could solve it, but we can't, and tries to kind of cover foolishly himself, and is certainly a foil for the opposite of Dupin, the idiot, but with position, is the police chief. And he says, not entirely without saying, actually much like Dupin and the narrator, he is saying without saying, a bit smarter than previously in the stories it seems, but still foolish and stupid from the beginning. He comes to ask Dupin to solve a case, but he initially acts like he doesn't need a case to be solved, but then immediately is asking for Dupin to solve the case. He can't, and claims he probably could, like a fool. So he returns to Dupin to take another case that he is charged to solve personally and can't. This also seems like he has been charged, likely by the Queen, we learn from his own foolish words, to solve a case he can't, so he's going to have Dupin solve it, and then he's going to conceal, it seems, from the Queen who solved the case. And this also is consistent with, in the end, he takes the letter and wordlessly leaves, quickly to show the case has been solved without even thinking of asking Dupin how he did it, because he's not interested. He just wants the case to be, on the face of it, solved. The chief is perfectly the opposite of Dupin in this way. He cares about appearance, not about actuality, not about the ability to think or the ability to reason. He cares about what looks best on the surface, so he wants the case to be solved. He can't, and then he isn't interested in the methods. He doesn't even stick around to hear a word about it. But we will. I hope you do anyways, and hear mine. The narrator says it's quite a coincidence that they were simply sitting there pondering the first two cases when in fact a third mystery case here, the third story, rolls in to itself. But it's not if Dupin knows the chief is coming. Now, if Dupin has his ear to the ground, and if he has been around, and we are shown later in the story he is, at first in this story, given the first two, we understand that shut up in the house is the narrator and Dupin, his friend. They've been living as weirdos off together, and they don't really interact with the public. But then, in the end of this story, it is very quickly revealed that Dupin gets around, doesn't really need to sleep, so he can be out in the daytime, apparently, as well as in the nighttime with his friends. These are the last we hear of Dupin. In the first story, he is someone who can only go out at night. We are told he feels the emotions of others so powerfully and sees their motives in their faces and hearts with the window in their hearts open to him. He can't go out. But in this case, he has been out and about. And so we are to understand now, wait, who has he been talking to? And he may very well have been near the court, I'm going to suggest, and actually knows the chief is coming. It is not a coincidence. Actually, Dupin and the narrator are talking about what Dupin is talking about before the chief shows up. That would be the first kind of hidden bit, one of them, which seems to have an easy answer once you've read through the story once. The chief says the case isn't a killing like the last two, but something simple that the cops can handle. No, they can't. He's lying. But Dupin might find interesting. So he comes and he lies to Dupin. He lies to the master reader of hearts in a very silly, stupid way, showing he does not understand Dupin at all because he can be seen by us and the narrator, everyone. In fact, the narrator starts to show that he is the protege of Dupin, but then Dupin bests the narrator. The narrator is learning since the first and the second case we see in his back and forth with the chief, as Dupin largely stays silent and concealed, as the real Yoda here. He says the case is odd, like Dupin himself. Clearly, he's like, oh, it's a weirdo. You know, it's weird, like you. He feels emotions indeed, doesn't he? As opposed to the outer appearance. Dupin says maybe the case is too simple for the cops, for you. I like that a lot. It's confusing because it's too simple, too profound. The chief laughs heartily at this. He says, this is impossible. How could that ever be? Well, that's clearly the case, and he's a fool looking right in the face of it. And Dupin, and insulting him, who is the one he's asking to solve the case. We learn for the queen. And I'm going to say Dupin knows the queen perfectly fine, which is how he knew of all of this. But that's not revealed, I will claim, until the end. In one particular line, just like in the first story, which is after a brief pause, and that line itself tells you a lot by barely telling you anything. And in the end of this, we're going to have producing a note from his desk, and that is going to tell you everything, I will argue. Dupin says maybe the case is too simple. The chief laughs and says it is quite complicated. As someone in a high quarter, we very quickly learn the queen, or at least that seems to be unsaid and quite certain, had a document stolen from the royal apartments. So it's the king or the queen or the jack of all trades. Much as the word, forgive me for the triggering word, the simple word rape was absent from the second story, which is clearly all about it, unfortunately. Don't read it if you don't want to hear anything like that, but you won't if you read the second story because that word does not occur. Again, mistreated, manhandled is in its place. The chief tells us in so many indirect words, like Mean Streets, the movie, it's a masterwork of saying things without saying things. If you like saying things without saying things in the first two stories, and if you are into what I'm into, which is how Poe prefigures a bit of Wittgenstein with saying things without saying things, then this rolls from the previous story, which was unfortunately much about sexual assault, without saying it, either the simpler or the more complex words and saying middle words in between somewhat with so many syllables. The chief in so many indirect words tells us, very directly but indirectly, which is exactly Mean Streets. What's this? What? That Minister D. Now, in fact, it took somebody a while to figure out who Minister D is compared to Dupin. And I'm going to let you think about that as we go along here, and I'll reveal that because another scholar in the 70s actually revealed what he thinks is the story, and I'm going to go with that guy's interpretation. Minister D, we're told of his name, the villain. Minister D is the villain. No, I'm not claiming Minister D is Dupin himself. Minister D, we're told of his name, which again is kind of conspicuous when you read it a second time, and you are thinking what I'm thinking, and what that scholar was thinking along with. He entered the royal apartments and saw the queen reading a letter she tried to hide but couldn't, so she left it on the table in plain sight. Hiding things out in plain sight is a major theme of all three of the stories. This story displays that very well, and I will talk Birdie. When the king arrives, the minister, recognizing the handwriting, now it's the king arrives and the other royal, we're told by elimination thus, it is the queen, decently. Without it, but it's a possibility. And remember the first story, Dupin says, it is not certainty to certainty to certainty, but reasoning by possibility, which is more brilliant and profound and shows more capability. Or can. So the queen, but we're not told the queen, but we already understand, probably has a lover. Now that would be not only being unfaithful, but that would technically be, for the queen and the lover, treason. Now that actually makes the crime not a killing but worse, in a sense. Treason against the crown is a very serious crime, and this potentially is that. I'm not going to get into jurisprudence here or there or anywhere, but that makes this possibly a more serious crime. And who do you think committed the crime on the other end of the Queen, as it were? So she left the letter, from whom? We don't know yet. I would argue we already have the author in sight, but we are told of his name. What we are told of Minister D, the Queen tries to hide the letter. When the King arrives, the minister, recognizing the handwriting of the letter. Now, we are told the Minister D recognizes the handwriting of the letter. And seeing his chance to blackmail what we assume is the Queen, puts another letter down by the first, then picks up the Queen's letter and leaves. All while the King is there, so the Queen can't say anything. This is also hiding in plain sight in a dual way. Clearly, like Mary and or Marie, the Queen is up to something or someone. We have lady folk up to, well, I would say thinking and figuring things out, and I've never been one to consider women irrational or illogical, you know? And they're being a bit logical and social with the chess moves here, it would seem, yes? A bit illicit. So Poe's audience would likely know from the papers that Caroline, Princess of Wales, wrote a letter to her husband, King George IV, over marital difficulties that got into the wrong hands, and it became a major political scandal. This would be the reality like for Mary Rogers that we, the public and the reading public of Poe, would have understood. Without saying it, we can imagine the Queen as a lover other than the King, which is not only infidelity, but again, treason, high crimes, perhaps misdemeanors, I wouldn't worry. The Queen is mixing her interests improperly, but the minister is mixing business with his own power. So they are both committing crimes they can't let the King figure out, in fact, and that becomes central. Neither can really let everything out into the full light of day, and Dupin does not himself ever in the three stories, because he leaves things concealed and lying in plain sight in the three different stories, as I argue. Luckily, the King, throughout the whole course and story, remains entirely clueless through the case. The sinister minister, like Dupin, can read people, reading the Queen correctly, first her anxiety and then her position. The Queen has charged the chief with finding her lost letter, but we never learn anything about its contents, which is brilliant. Its word or overall emotional point, but we suspect exactly what it is. We already have enough to know it's I love you, don't I's, and she doesn't want other eyes to see it. Dupin notes the minister can't use the letter openly, but as long as he holds onto it and doesn't use it, he has the Queen under his thumb. The minister, like Dupin and the narrator, is out all night every night, and the chief had the entire police force, all the King's men. I have to say they must be intuiting Humpty Dumpty a bit. They turn over every inch of the minister's apartment several times for hours without finding anything, and search every building 2 buildings over, using every technique to the fullest extent. We are exhaustively told they use microscopes on all the cracks in the furniture. Checking all hiding places. They have all the resources of the state. They have all the policemen. They test the floor and the furniture, police people perhaps, and the chief also says, without saying it directly, that he personally has dressed up with other cops as robbers, detained the minister twice, searched him and didn't find the letter. The chief of police dressed up like a criminal and committed crimes against a minister, and did this multiple times, and no one said anything, not the minister, not him, at least not to the King. And he's posed as the chief of a band of robbers, or perhaps, yeah, boss, says it'd be even better if he posed, as an actor, as a henchman. That'd be even further off. I don't trust the chief to be that smart, though. I do trust Dupin to be precisely that smart. And then they didn't find the letter on him, which means unless the minister can't be keeping the letter on him all the time, otherwise he knows they would take it from him as in these ways. So he has it hidden in his apartment somewhere, and they've checked all the nooks and crannies of all the furniture and floorboards, and they cannot find it. Apparently, robbing people can count as time served on the force for Her Majesty's honor and defense. In the movie Duck Soup, Groucho Marx turns to his men, protecting the matriarch at their final stand against the enemy, and says, "Remember, you're fighting for this woman's honor," which is probably more than she ever did. Dupin says the minister is not a complete fool, but the chief says the minister is a poet, so he is nearly a fool. Now, this is the part where, again, the poet and the mathematician. Dupin says, "True, after a long drag." Now, if you watch my videos about the first story, I claim that after a brief pause is a key line that needs to be paid attention to in that story that tells us things if we read it and feel it out. After a long drag. Now, first he says, "True, after a long drag." That's brilliant, because he doesn't say true the way we read it. Immediately, he, after a long drag, which then we can read his emotions and his pause. If we're paying attention, we don't just read the word true and skim. Yes? We're paying close attention and feeling for Dupin and trying to feel his heart and his emotions. After a long drag, instead of after a brief pause, he says true, but of course he's duplicitous as Dupin. With the narrator using a similar set of words for the sailor's pause in the first story, showing us without telling us Dupin is offended and disagrees, clearly, which is the opposite of how he presents himself. Somewhat like the chief, but better, but feels that he and others are various sorts of fools, some more self-aware than the chief of police, he says, implies. Nicely. Dupin says he is guilty of a bit of poetry himself, and the narrator takes over questioning the chief much like Dupin. So the narrator, much like in Zen and other things, the narrator now pops in and shows he has also been learning from the master and demonstrates he is somewhat decent. You find this in text too, where someone shows that they can be like the master as an underling, which shows the master's power, shows they can teach, that people can follow their example and learn, and they have something to give. So Dupin, which shows us the narrator's time with Dupin has done the narrator's mind good, and that the narrator can feel his friend's frustration. The narrator reads Dupin correctly, unlike the chief. Of course, he lives with him. But after suggesting several things the cops have tried, the narrator concludes the letter isn't in the minister's apartments, but Dupin says no, it is. It is in the apartments. In other words, we're shown the narrator. It is brilliant in these stories how the next thing is simply contradicting the last thing, and Poe does this consistently. Tight, perfect writing. As perfect as anything underneath the ideal, down here gets. As soon as we can suspect, wow, the narrator, and if we're reading this carefully like the other stories, wow, the narrator actually is a really amazing detective himself, he's getting there. And he says, well, it can't be in the apartment. Dupin completely contradicts the narrator we're admiring, throws us again, and says, nope, it's there. You and the chief are wrong. It's there. Search it again. Chief's like, what? He's like, nope, search it again. With the microscopes, go for it. Dupin says it is, and the cops should search again, even though they have gone over everything systematically with microscopes. Now, of course, what we learn is it's hiding in plain sight, and them going over it again with microscopes doesn't show them anything because they're missing what's in plain sight. Months later, the chief comes back, sadly sits in the same chair. Nothing has changed, as I just said. The narrator asks him about the case, and Dupin asks about the reward. The chief won't say what the reward is, but offers 50,000 francs. It clearly is larger, possibly far more handsome, from his own checkbook, which suggests the reward, again, is far larger. He already has that, as if Dupin wouldn't be able to read this in his response. Again, he's just clueless to how Dupin is handling all this. Dupin takes another slow drag of his pipe. We overemphasize this again. And tells the chief to cut him the check and he'll hand him the letter right now. Now, this shocks the narrator and the chief. How do you have the letter right now? Everything in the the three stories so far has made us think that Dupin has been shut up inside. There is no way he could possibly have the letter. It would shock the audience and everyone there. The narrator and the chief, that's everyone there. It doesn't shock Dupin, though, so perhaps I misspoke. The narrator, Dupin's friend who lives with him, is astonished and had no idea the letter was there with them. The chief takes several minutes to respond. He just stares at Dupin silently. What's on the inside? Pulls out his checkbook, writes the check, and Dupin gets up and produces the letter from his writing desk. We are specifically told, if we are reading carefully, Dupin produced a note from his desk. Now, what I'm arguing is he did it twice. He produced it once, he wrote it. He wrote it to the queen. He sent it to her. She left it out in plain sight. He then now is going to explain to us, we have no idea yet, and you wouldn't if you haven't read the story, yet before this talk. He already has the thing, and he produces it from his desk twice. He's producing it when he pulls it out because he put it back in his desk when he went and got it from Minister D, the villain. And he did during the daytime, and no one here suspected that he was out during the day because he's a weirdo who's only out at night. But he's been getting around, and he continues to show us this through the rest of the story, completely, very much overturning and contradicting what we were explicitly told about him in the first, which I don't imagine is a mistake or oversight on Poe's part. The chief takes several minutes to respond, staring at Dupin silently, pulls out his checkbook, writes the check, Dupin gets up and produces the letter from his desk. I would say wordlessly here a second time. This is again like the Chinese logicians of ancient times. A wheel does not touch the ground. Mostly. I mean, you leave off the mostly, but 99% of a wheel's never touching the ground at any time. So the wheel doesn't touch the ground, I swear, for my client. I just leave off, a little bit of it does. Always. Unless it's a steering wheel, and then none of it does. But some, but barely any of the wheels, The chief leaves with the letter immediately, without asking a word, as I mentioned how Dupin found it, which again shows he completely lacks character and any concern with how to think or reason. He doesn't imagine this is different from his reasoning. He doesn't even think about other people's reasoning or whether or not he could think better than himself, merely having image and position. And we can read this in his haste, like we read in the haste of the sailor in the first story. A likely indicator of how valuable it is for his pocket and position with the queen. Now, this could indicate how much the cop himself, the chief himself, is guilty, and possibly the lover of the queen. If he is the lover of the queen, she made a poor choice, but I think she made one far better. Dupin says to the narrator, now that the chief is gone, it's just the duo dynamic again, alone. Dupin again says the cops are often all right. He doesn't actually say openly, you're stupid. He says, most of the time they're okay. 99% of the time is fine, like the wheel. But this was a particularly interesting case that requires any skill, or thinking at all, is what he implies, which is why they didn't find it. The letter wasn't hidden. It was lying in plain sight. The cops were looking for a hiding place, not for something in plain sight on the mantle, it turns out. Dupin says many schoolboys are smarter, and he met an extraordinary boy. Now, how does he meet a schoolboy? He must be hanging out in the daytime and need very little sleep at all, because now we're told he's been hanging out in the daytime. I'm going to suggest he gets up to other things in the daytime, because he clearly interacts with the minister and gets the letter, and now he says he's met a young boy who's more brilliant than any of the others, and he doesn't imply I'm smarter or he's smarter than me. He's like, yeah, now there's brilliance, without pride, without position, merely recognizing brilliance in others. He says that there is schoolboys are sometimes smarter, and he met an extraordinary boy who could best anyone at a simple guessing game of even and odd marbles held in the hand. Am I holding odd or even marbles right now? And you try to fake out the other person in ways by clearing his mind and feeling what his opponent is feeling. Clearing his mind and feeling what his opponent is feeling. That is very similar to Dupin says if I just watch people, they have a window to their hearts for me. It is too close to be a coincidence. He is comparing the two from this to the first story. Just as the narrator suggests in the beginning of the Rue Morgue. Dupin says the police methods were perfect. He doesn't say they were faulty, but they can't step back and see the big picture, much as the words on large signs can be missed when nearby. It's a great image. The narrator asks if the minister is the poet, as there are two brothers. The narrator knows that there are two brothers. The narrator clearly doesn't know that one of the brothers is right here, which is what one scholar took a long time, I think until the 70s, to mention or point out. There are two brothers. This is starting to become a little bit obvious. Again, I'm amazed it took people a while to figure this out, is that I'm sure, Poe died a few years right after this story. I think this was written in 43 or 42. Poe died in 45 or 46. He didn't have a long time to explain any of this to anybody, nor did he at all, I think. But there are two brothers, one a poet and the other a mathematician. Dupin says the minister is both a poet and a mathematician. This is both a poet and a mathematician. I love it. And knows him well. There are two brothers. He knows Minister D well, Dupin does. Now, again, it took somebody a while to point this out. And I got something even more than that. The narrator says most of the world thinks mathematics is the supreme form of reason. And Dupin says mathematics and the French have tried. The French, which would be Comte and positivism, I imagine, have tried to spread this error in the public as best they can. And this is where Poe prefigures Nietzsche and Wittgenstein best, and please see my talks on Nietzsche and my future talks on Wittgenstein, which I won't explain here at all. Mere math, Dupin says, the genius, who is being presented as the better mathematician and the better poet than everybody, which you can read between the lines. Mere math, for somebody who can do math, as well as anybody here for Dupin, can't reason at all without emotions and poetry. Motive for a detective in murder mysteries. This isn't a murder, but it's worse. Dupin may be referring to Comte's positivism again, which is a major basis of modern analytic philosophy. I will get into how Wittgenstein invented truth table logic in his early work and then turned against it in his later work, but it fits very well with Poe's detective stories. I really would love to know that Wittgenstein knew of these detective stories. I know that Wittgenstein liked murder mysteries. I do not know, as of yet, that he knew of these. Carroll, I do believe, did know of them, but I do not know that Lewis Carroll read them. I know that he had a book about them that praises them highly. Praises Poe at least highly for the first. Dupin says, analysis conveys algebra about as much as ambitus, seeking office, implies ambition. Notice the chief isn't trying too hard for his station, or beyond it. As much as religio, what binds us, religion, and ominous honesty, the upstanding citizens are honorable men, honest men. In other words, all of these are expressions that are not literally true. The words and the facts are not literally true. It's what we feel and imply together with the factual set words that show us the meaning. Lewis Carroll says, mean what you say, and say what you mean. The words and the emotions, the math and the poetry. This does seem to be the way he is going back and forth. It does seem a bit mind and body. Cicero used the term for men of his own political party, omnis honesty. Thus, analysis is more than algebra, as thought is more than symbol and title. Now, possibly talking about the chief, yeah? Who just left with the prize. Dupin quotes the French aphorist Chamfort, a favorite quote, often quoted by Poe in person, and Chamfort is a favorite of Nietzsche, actually, as are the French poets. You can bet on the fact that any idea or convention widely accepted is wrong, for it is simply convenient to the greatest number. Let me say that again. You can bet on the fact that any idea or convention widely accepted is wrong, for it is simply convenient to the greatest number. He just argued that math is not the simple basis of logic and thought. That is very later Wittgenstein. I will argue that later because I have not gotten to later or earlier Wittgenstein yet in these talks. Poe chooses a poet to show us, Chamfort, the greater truth, while suggesting mere mathematics is for common dupes, Dupin, who understand what generally. Abstract algebra does not lead to general truth because in morality and chemistry the whole is more than the simple sum of its parts. It is not finite truths, atomic and complete in themselves, a la Russell, but truths of relation, which is much later Wittgenstein, of relationships between the elements of the situation. That is very much what Wittgenstein suggests in his later work, Beyond Formal Logic. And I do enjoy consistently suggesting Poe, Carroll, and later Wittgenstein consistently show us emotion is a core element of logic and interpretation and thought we should not be shutting out. This story is excellent for all of that, especially if someone turns out to be overly amorous and is concealing it beyond words and beneath them, like the carpet of the philosophy of furniture. He accuses the mathematicians of pagan mythology, polytheism, and says if you tell a mathematician truth is not simply equations, you should take care to step back, as they will try to knock you out. They'll try to attack you and kill you, unaware of the overall emotions involved. People who over-fetishize rules and math and science aren't good people, conversant back and forth with others sometimes, let's just say, Poe notices, and this is what Nietzsche, and I think Wittgenstein in his early and later period was convinced that modern times, very Schopenhauer, the history of a village is the history of an empire. This is humanity. We're not getting more or less logical. Few who occupy position, even speaking English is privilege and position, understand this today. Still. This is from the 1800s. Dupin says he knew the minister left his apartment so the cops could thoroughly search it. So he visited the minister the other day. He knows the minister, and he visits him as a friend. More than a friend, it's easy to see, as a scholar has already shown. So he visited the minister the other day with his green eyeglasses. If I do ever draw Dupin, or if you do, you should draw him with green eyeglasses, because he has poor eyesight, but he has great insight, mind, and emotion over the manifest in the body and the revealed. So he uses his weak eyes as an excuse to search the room while talking to the minister with the green glasses on. He uses his weak eyes, and he uses them correctly, so he even uses what is weak in him in concert with everything else to solve this case. He doesn't solve this in spite of his weak eyes, he solves them with them. And emotions are very much a weakness in human thought, and yet he solves thought and logic in cases with emotion and motive and feeling for others, including the victims and the perpetrators. He does not look over the mantel first. He first looks at the minister's death. That was nice and Freudian. At the minister's desk. The minister does not necessarily die by the end, although I don't hold him in good standing. Dupin says the daring, dashing, brilliant minister. Now, why would Dupin necessarily possibly think he goes out of his way, actually, to say the minister is daring, dashing, and brilliant. Now, if there were two brothers, and if Dupin is praising the minister as daring, dashing, and brilliant, what might that suggest? He definitely praises the guy we already know to be a horrid villain. Why would he? We can feel this out. So he leaves a gold snuff box on the minister's table, returns the next day to fetch it, pretending, pays a man in the street to fire a gun in the air as if it is misfired. At first, we're told of the gunshot and not that he set it up, which is, again, revealing beyond the facts and the situation and what is manifest. The hidden, as the Taoists say, beyond the manifest, and vice versa. Dupin switches the letter on the mantle for a copy he created from his own desk at home. Now, actually, if the minister switches out the letter on the desk, and if it's not so easy to notice, which could be implied, and if Dupin does the same or similar, that actually implies that all the handwriting involved is very similar, which is another clue here. If he leaves a note in substitution and it so turns out the minister didn't notice it, what does that also suggest? Quite simply, when the minister rushes to the window to check out the gunshot, now the minister's nervous. He's actually embedded. He pretends to be exhausted, is another detail I left out of the notes, but actually, in pretending to be exhausted, Dupin, who's clearly been up all day and night, knows he's just faking being tired. He has endless energy, he says, to be up all days and nights. Now, who else would that make him exactly like? A daring, dashing, brilliant fellow, it would seem, in the mouth of Dupin. So when the nervous minister rushes to the window, he knows this guy so well in his behavior, doesn't he? Dupin switches the letter on the mantle for a copy he created from his own desk at home. We are told he produced a copy of the letter that serves and without even having seen it, he produces a copy of the letter that then serves to dupe the villain. And then he produced that from his own desk at home, he tells us. Dupin says the minister would have killed him, like a mathematician would knock you over, or down, or worse, if he knew he had the letter. Clearly this minister cares more, being a poet and a mathematician, more about position, and is a minister D, more than Dupin. So he left quickly, but he left the minister a clue, as leaving it blank would simply be insulting. He needs to bait and taunt the minister. A verse that should let the minister know just how he was fooled when he next looks at the letter. Apparently Dupin wants to be complexly insulting, not simply insulting. The minister has stepped on a lot of people to gain more and more power, Dupin says. A monster of a man, and a genius, both poet and mathematician. So the worst of monsters. Now that is excellent. Right at the moment we're told only a true genius must be both poet and mathematician, must be emotionally brilliant and verbally, factually, mathematically, all that run together. I would say verbal and emotional intelligence, but I don't want to claim those are simply the dueling types, but they seem a bit it. So poet and mathematician, now poetry is also verbal, let's say emotional and factual, perhaps intelligence. So both poet and mathematician, though emotional and I guess perhaps the counter side of emotion and all of that interwoven. So the worst of monsters, because the best used for the worst is the worst. Now that also implies, of course, Dupin sees himself as poet, mathematician, and best, and doing this for good, for Le Bon in the first story and others. Dupin says the minister did him an evil once in Vienna. They've traveled together? They've known each other a very long time? Why were they in Vienna together? Much as the bank clerk did him a favor once in the first story, which ties all of this together, except this time he's going after someone evil and not saving someone good here, which is again why Dupin solves the case, and so he leaves the minister a final quote in his own handwriting, which the minister will recognize. And if we translate, which he doesn't, it says, "A scheme so hateful, if it is not worthy of Atreus, is worthy of Thyestes." Now it took folks a while for somebody to point out that in ancient Greek myth, Thyestes sleeps with his twin brother Atreus' wife. Atreus gets revenge by serving Thyestes his own children in a stew, famously, forgive me, as if serving up the children the results of your own behavior. There are no children being served up here, but the results and the fruit of your own actions is being served back to the minister by, who very well could be, his twin brother, Dupin, of the minister D, namely Minister Dupin. His brother and twin. Both are both poets and mathematicians, and one is good and the other not so much, although neither would say. Dupin and Minister D of the Purloined letter are twins, as the critic Milner argued, and I believe in the 70s, early 70s. Which many missed before him. I'm, again, reading the story closely, I'm pretty amazed it took over 100 years, almost 150, 40 years for somebody to point out they're twin brothers, I think. Maybe somebody pointed out earlier and I'm ignorant. Both of them poets and mathematicians, the two brothers, both handsome, both brilliant, which leaves one more thing unsolved. Like the sailor's second in the Rue Morgue. Who is the Queen's lover, the Queen's second? Could be the chief, or the narrator, but there's only one possible candidate who is handsome and brilliant, poet and mathematician who seems to have little energy but dupes others and gets around, is talking to a schoolboy he admires, like his twin but unlike his twin, not a monster. A weirdo, not a monster, but someone who loves and cares for others, because we are literally told Dupin produced the note from his desk. For the chief, if we read those words literally and figuratively, duplicitously with Dupin, although they are the words of his narrator and protege, one could say, and twin of sorts. Yes, his partner in crime and crime solving. Dupin is the lover, and he produced the note from his desk twice. The first time when he wrote it for the Queen as her lover, and the second time when he retrieved it for the chief. That is why his twin recognized the handwriting while the letter was in the Queen's hand from the beginning, or at least as she plopped it onto the desk. And that is why Dupin could produce a note from his desk twice. When it says he produced the note from his desk, that has a double meaning, and that solves everything in the case better than anything. I do believe that is the simple meaning Poe intended, but all I can do is suggest the brilliant hanging possibility, which is exactly what Dupin says is the sort of thing that can be solved which shows brilliance best. I really have thoroughly admired these stories. The closer I read the first, the closer I was to saying there is something hiding here, and I think the second sailor's death is clearly it. And then as I said to myself, okay, well, the second story seems like the secret has already been revealed. It really was possibly a place of abortions and that's what went wrong, but Poe had to sort of change it in and out and kind of screwed that one up. So he went back, and with the simple third story, I think he left it open who the Queen's lover is, and then he just doesn't talk about it or try to solve it. Well, why wouldn't Dupin in the end suggest anything like solving it? Well, because if you read the words of Dupin and the final words and quote of the first story, it suggests solve what isn't solved. We read the final words of this story. Milner solved that they are twin brothers. That is excellent, but that's not a crime. It's not a crime to be one's twin brother. It is a crime, however, lying in plain sight as a second level of secret here, a second twist, that it solves the case very well, and it would make Dupin himself, the detective, a criminal and a traitor, but also our hero and quite the archetype, as he was for Holmes. That is my talk on this. Hopefully you enjoy. I will be continuing on to do my talks about Lewis Carroll for the North America Lewis Carroll Society. And I will be arguing that there is much Aristotle hidden in Carroll that he is showing there. So if you like the hidden things I find in Poe, please watch those. If you hate all this and you think I'm some kind of chump, well, I will recede into my own machinations with partners in crime, etc. So, much love, much happiness. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Please see my videos in the past and onward into the future. And as usual, I will see ya, if I do indeed ever see ya.